welcome everyone. How are you all? I see everybody likes to sit in the back. Is that what it is? This isn't like regular church. You can sit up front. It's okay. I'm Kelly Edmondson, and I am the director of Montgomery County Department of Social Services, and we are excited that you all are here today. We will be videotaping this to distribute out for our staff members and things that weren't able to join us today. Our services, my services supervisors that do child protective services and adult protective services, foster care, and our in-home, they went and saw this presentation and came back and were super excited about this presentation and wanted to bring it to our community so that everybody can just hear the same information. We're serving the same kids, and we really want to enhance our community as much as possible. So thank you all so much for coming. This is Heather Lincoln. She's my foster care supervisor. She's the one that was spearheading everything and gathered all the snacks along with her cohorts at work to get everything set up today. So thank you, Heather, for that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Jo Oliver Hendricks. Is that correct?
Hedrick. Yeah.
I apologize.
No, you're okay.
And she will be presenting this. Did everybody get a copy of the pamphlet? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that I can be here with you all this morning, and I'm not gonna lie, I feel like I'm back in like worship band from my childhood. So this is gonna be fun. So as they said, I am Mary Jo Oliver Hedrick. I am now Dr. Hedrick. That's a new development as of like last weekend. So I appreciate y'all being here with me, and thank you. I appreciate that. It was 8 years, man. 8 years, way too long. But yeah, so I am Dr. Hedrick, and I am a developmental psychologist. And I am not diagnosing any of you, I promise. I'm not trying to watch your behaviors. I work primarily with kiddos who are substance exposed. So I work from prenatal development all the way up until the age of 18, and I specialize in understanding symptoms and behaviors and long-term effects of substance use and exposure in childhood. So if you want to hit the next slide. So me, I am here in my role as Substance Use Disorder Program Coordinator for the Virginia Rural Health Association. And what my organization tries to do is equip community partners with resources about substance use, about substance exposure. We do a lot of other things, but I am the Substance Use Disorder Program Coordinator specifically. And I also collaborate with a nonprofit called Uplift Appalachia. And so what we do with that nonprofit is we kind of pick up where VRJ left off, and we help train and equip community members and churches to partner with DSS agencies and hospitals to provide wraparound care and social intervention. We know that since COVID, a lot of people haven't been able to rejoin their social groups. And so we're really trying to equip the churches and community organizations to do that. Okay, so jumping right into it, we're going to talk about drugs, a lot of drugs. So I want us to talk about substance use and exposure in the terms of a playground. And we're going to talk about the way we can be kind of the fence posts and the gates for the kids in our care to experience their substance exposure and to kind of experience these behaviors and provide a safe environment for them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about creating that safe environment and establishing trust. So I'm only going to focus on 4 drugs during this talk. They are our most common drugs that we see in our area. And so number 1, we have the exposure to methamphetamine as our most common substance that our kiddos are testing positive for. Methamphetamine, and something that I want to make sure I'm very clear about, methamphetamine, basically any kind of drug that can be airborne. If you are using it, or a parent in the household is using it, or a sibling in the household is using it, if it is in the household, the child that is living there, while they might not be actively using and partaking in that, they are experiencing the effects of those substances. So you can become exposed to substances in a couple of different ways. Methamphetamine is a really great kind of example. So taking methamphetamine typically involves making the substance airborne. And so even if you use methamphetamine when the kid is at school or when the kid is in a different room or maybe you're outside, the residue remains on your skin. And as the child interacts with you, as the child interacts with the parent that has recently used, they are then exposed just through the residue on the skin. Something else we should note is that you actually excrete the drugs out through your pores as well. So whenever you sweat or whenever you exercise and interact with that kiddo, they are getting exposed to the substance through the sweat in your skin. So if the parent is using, the kiddo is using. And we see that very, very commonly with methamphetamine. So our second most common substance that our kiddos are exposed to is pot. We know that that's legal in Virginia now, and it's basically everywhere. So we see a lot of poly substance exposure as well. So poly just means all of these substances are present, or more than one of these substances are present. And we're going to talk about kind of the dangers of marijuana on a developing brain. And again, that can be exposed through residue on surfaces, the parent, things like that. And then we have cocaine as our third most frequent substance that kiddos are exposed to. And then lastly, we have opioids, which is actually decreasing. So we're encouraged to know that kiddo opioid exposure is decreasing. But something I want to highlight is the data tells us that about 60% nationwide, kids that enter foster care are entering either directly or indirectly related to parental substance use. I work in Southwest Virginia, the center of kind of our drug epidemic, and most DSS agencies say that that number is closer to like 85 or 90% of the kids that they work with. So I want us to keep in mind that a lot of the kiddos that we interact with may be substance exposed and may have something else going on. And we're going to talk about kids being an iceberg here in a little bit. But they may have something else going on that is relating to their behavior. So how they show up in the classroom, how they show up in your foster homes, how they show up in your offices, how they show up in the courtroom are all going to be influenced by the environment that they are raised in, whether through substances or through experiences. So we're going to talk about the brain. So I'm a psychologist. I focus in neuroscience and cognitive brain development. So we're going to talk a lot about the major divisions of the brain and the way each substance impacts the brain. So I am going to go all neuroscience on you. I hope that's okay. But hopefully this will make sense. And as I go through the presentation, I want you all to feel free to raise your hand, to ask questions. I really find that that's very helpful. If there's something that you're thinking about that I may have missed, I want to make sure that you're able to address that. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the overall structure of the brain. So if any of you guys have heard my talks before, I talk about the way we're born with kind of a reptile brain. So that would be our hind brain here. So our reptile brain is down here. It's fully developed when we are born, and unless we're dealing with premature babies. But this kind of bottom part of our brain, it regulates our temperature, it regulates our ability to breathe, it regulates shaking and kind of those reflexes. So if you reach out and you touch something hot in the kitchen, you immediately pull it back without a conscious thought. That's kind of in this core of our reptile brain. And then when we're born, we have this forebrain right there, this top part, and it's what I like to call the Play-Doh brain. So it's the part of our brain that is malleable, that can be shaped, and that is completely dependent on our environment and what's going on in it. So what we're going to look at today is the way that drugs interact with this kind of basic brain that has already been developed and how it shapes the way the top of our brain interacts with our environment. And this top of our brain is what we use when we are in school, when we're learning our multiplication tables, when we're reading books, when we're understanding rules and how to follow them. And so that really influences a lot of behavior. And then we're also going to talk briefly about the midbrain. And so the midbrain is like this little piece of brain in between the top and the bottom. And it's really just kind of the connecting point for your reptile brain and your Plato brain. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But before we get too far into this, I'm going to show you a quick video that kind of gives an overview of brain development and talks a little bit about early experiences.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Something that I really, really enjoy about that video is that it lays out how important it is to have community around you, especially as a kiddo that's going through a lot of things. But as you saw, we have that air traffic control going on in our Plato brain, right? We're trying to see, and as adults, we have that, right? We can regulate ourselves. Like right now, I know that it's not a good idea for me to like plan out my grocery shopping. Like I'm focused on this task. And so kids need that too, and that develops over time. And so what we understand is that when kids are exposed to substances, that air traffic control kind of disappears a little bit. So their ability to regulate what's going on in their mind and control their movements changes, especially based on the type of substance that they're exposed to. And so something I really, really want to talk about is the way that kids have their needs met. So the very basic things that kids need is their physical needs, right? They need sleep, they need food, water, physical touch is a basic need, and the absence of dangerous substances. So a child needs to grow up in an environment in which their brain can develop without anything external influencing the way that their brain functions. So by taking in a dangerous illicit substance, the brain adjusts and tries to protect the child by releasing more of one hormone and not enough of another because they're kind of scared of the danger that's coming. Next, we need security and safety, predictability. We'll get to talking about being boring here in a little bit. Then we need the love and belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization. But what I really want to notice is if you do not have that bottom thing right there, you can't have anything above it. So if you're not able to be in a safe environment, absence of dangerous substances, if you can't sleep, if you don't have food, if you don't have water, it's going to be really hard for you to do your math problems, because that's at the very top, right? It's going to be really hard to connect with your loved ones and your families. And that's really kind of the crux of what happens when we're exposed to substances. It kind of hijacks the kiddos' brains. And so we'll go on and talk specifically about methamphetamine first. So methamphetamine is a stimulant. So a stimulant is something that speeds up all of the messages between the body and the brain. So that means if we're going at like an average of like 30 miles per hour, when you're on methamphetamine, it's more like 90 miles an hour. I just came here on 81, and I can speak from personal experience. It's all going really fast. So make sure that when you know that a kiddo or a person that you're involved with has been exposed to methamphetamine or is using methamphetamine, everything is kind of in fast forward for them. Everything is going really fast. Everything is really, really sped up. And you can be exposed through methamphetamine through injecting, ingesting, or through the air, which is the most common way of administering methamphetamine. So methamphetamine is typically used in an airborne way, and the kiddos that we see that have the highest rate of methamphetamine in their system is when their parents have used it in a small confined space. So think you're going to have higher levels of meth in your system if you smoked meth in a car rather than in a room like this size. So our kiddos that have really, really high levels of methamphetamine have likely been in close confined quarters with the person using methamphetamine. And so what does meth do to the brain? So it does a lot of things to our brain. So the first thing, I'm going to start and go bottom up. So we're going to start with this kind of bottom reptile brain. It's not changing, but it can be influenced. So with methamphetamine in the hindbrain, so our reptile brain, we have a really, really rapid heart rate. So if you're like cuddling up on a kiddo and they have what feels like butterfly wings on their chest, that might be related to methamphetamine exposure. We also see that kiddos who have been exposed to meth tend to run a fever, so their body temperature is just on a higher level than another kiddo. Also, we see extreme hunger in the initial exposure period. So we would say, like within the first couple of days of using methamphetamine, we would see a really, really high appetite and maybe fear around food insecurity. So maybe throwing a temper tantrum or something like that if they're not allowed free access to food whenever they need it. And then we see major sleep disruptions. And when I say disruptions, I mean no sleep. So if your brain is going like 100 miles an hour, it is super, super hard for them to kind of calm down and get themselves in a place where their brain can enter that restful cycle in that REM sleep. So we don't see a lot of sleeping in substance-exposed kiddos. And something I do want to know as I'm talking through all of this, all of these symptoms that I'm talking about are based in research. We did not go out and give children meth. We would not do that. But this is all of the observational research that we have captured over the past couple of decades. And all of the references are going to be at the end of this slide presentation and also in your handouts if you want to do further reading. But this is all grounded in research and all things that we see occurring today. So I promise I'm not making any of this up. Okay, so in that hindbrain, we see that reptile brain is just overactive, right? So we see it speeding everything up, like we talked about with the stimulants. And then in our midbrain, so that's the connecting point between our reptile brain and our Plato brain, we see that it struggles to regulate emotions and behaviors. So emotions, that comes from a place in our brain called the amygdala. So that's something in the very center of our brain. It's halfway between our Plato brain, halfway between our reptile brain. And it is what tells our Plato brain that things are scary. And so kiddos that have been exposed to methamphetamine typically have really high levels of anxiety or hypervigilance. So a good example that I can give of this is kiddos that are kind of typical. Think about them here in like your church nursery. You have people coming in and out, you see different faces all the time, and after a while, the kid kind of gets used to being in an environment where they see different people, the door is opening and closing, and so a typical child who may not be exposed to methamphetamine will go off and play and do their own thing, but a child who may have been exposed to methamphetamine, they're going to be looking at that door every single time it opens. They're going to be startling a lot. They're going to jump at any kind of noise that may not interrupt the play of any other kiddos. So we're going to see them looking all the time and scanning for any threats in their environment. So we see a lot of increased anxiety. And then their ability to regulate their emotions. So remember, we're speeding everything up. They're going to be bouncing off the walls a little bit. And even though you may say, like, get down on their level and say, hey, I need you to calm down. Let's take some deep breaths. They are physically unable to calm themselves down and to calm down this rapid heart rate, this desire for food, and this kind of overactive thought process that they have. And so finally, we see in this Plato brain, so remember this is our brain that is being shaped, and it will not be fully developed until you're 25, this thing that's kind of changing. So the midbrain and the hindbrain are things that we would call the acute effects. So that's what's going to happen immediately after substance exposure. So the thing with methamphetamine is that it takes sometimes up to a year for methamphetamine to fully work its way out of a kiddo's system. And so long term, we see these kind of issues with our Plato brain. So we see a decrease in motivation. So their desire to do really well on their grades or on their exam. Planning their movement. So thinking through what they need to do next and following through moving their bodies. And an example that I usually give is when you're a kid and you're learning how to play soccer on the soccer team for the first time. You're going to think through, okay, the ball is a couple feet away from me. I need to take a couple steps forward and then kick with the inside of my foot, like all the soccer coaches tell you. They're going to have a really hard time planning out how to move their body in space and time. They might just like full send, run up to it and kick it, or they might pick it up and throw it. So they're going to have a really hard time planning out and coordinating their movements. And then we see a big problem with reward processing. And so what that means is they don't create a kind of cause and effect relationship between things happening in their environment. So maybe they just pushed another kid on the playground and the kid is laying there crying. And then they're just walking off doing their own thing and the teacher comes up to them and is like, hey, you just pushed that kid, go sit in timeout. And they're like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. I don't know what you're talking about. This is ridiculous. They're not able to connect the cause and effect of their behaviors really well. So you have to kind of create some more scaffolding for understanding that cause and effect relationship. So understanding punishment, understanding reward, and then we see long-term cognitive control deficits. And so what that basically means is we see a lot of ADHD symptomology. So inability to sit still in the classroom, or again, that impulse control. So that kind of speeding up of the initial effects can last long-term because the brain gets used to always being on forward, right? It's being sped up. So we see that they have a difficulty like holding themselves back and paying attention for long periods of time. So what are some of the implications for real life that we see? And I just gave a couple of examples. If you're thinking about this in the context of like a playroom and kids are trying to interact with each other, and there's a very specific set of plans that the teacher has just instructed them to do. While some of the other kids may be able to follow through with the game that they're playing with the parachute here, a kid who has been substance exposed may have to use a lot of social referencing, so they might be looking around a little bit more, or again, just like fully pursuing whatever pops into their mind. And they won't understand, oh, we all have to sit down now because I messed up the game, or because I wasn't paying attention and now the whole class is being punished. That doesn't get connected in their heads. So I'll just preface this by saying I live in Tennessee now. I grew up in Allegheny County, Virginia, and I live in Tennessee because that's where I got my Ph.D. Pot is not legal in Tennessee, air quotes. And so we don't see as much of marijuana exposure in our kiddos on the Tennessee side, but oh my word, y'all, people be using so much pot here. So marijuana is a hallucinogen. And something I really want to stress is if you are over the age of 25, pot is not going to do anything to your brain. You're going to be fine. It's going to give you all those like really positive effects that they talk about. I don't know. I was never cool. I was never offered any. I was definitely the snitch of the friend group, so I wouldn't know. And then I became a drug researcher, so that just solidified that for me. But we see this a lot in our kiddos now, and it's a hallucinogen. So that basically means that it distorts your ability to perceive reality. So we would say before the age of 25, introducing cannabis, marijuana into a kiddo's system can permanently change the way that they perceive reality. Especially with high doses of use, we see something called amotivational syndrome. And so that just means that they're very lethargic, they have a hard time maintaining interest and things like that over long-term chronic use. And something interesting about marijuana is what makes marijuana so great in our brains is that it actually triggers a chemical in our brain that already exists there. And it's actually the chemical that's released when we have really great relationships and really great social connection. And so our bodies are just like, oh my gosh, I feel so loved. This is so great. But at the same time, it's kind of distorting your sense of reality. So before the age of 25, I would not recommend using marijuana. And something that we do see in our kiddos is this long-term exposure is directly related to the development of schizophrenia, and a lot of these effects past the age of 25 can't be reversed. So something that I can talk about is a lot of those things that we saw in methamphetamine, like all those behaviors, a lot of those behaviors we can kind of plan to compensate if we know that those are going to happen. So we teach them different strategies, and eventually as the meth works its way out of their system, we can see recovery or healing from that substance exposure. But something that we see in marijuana that's very different is the earlier that you're exposed and the more that you're exposed to, we don't see that the effects can really be reversed. And this is, again, preliminary evidence from the research. And again, kiddos can be exposed through the air or ingestion. So what we see a lot of now is if a parent is maybe using methamphetamine, they'll give their kid an edible to help them go to sleep because that kid is bouncing off the walls and they're just like, oh my gosh, go to sleep. They'll give them an edible, and that's when we have that kind of polysubstance use. And so what's really scary about the potency of edibles is that they can actually put kiddos in a coma. What would normally be just kind of a mellowing out for an adult human with adult human organs ends up being very, very detrimental for a kiddo's brain. Okay, so in this brain, again, we have our reptile brain. So what's happening in this hindbrain here? So the biggest thing that we see that marijuana affects in our reptile brain is our sleep schedule. So we have this kind of normal, we rise with the sun, we go to bed with the moon, all those kinds of things. But marijuana kind of hijacks that system. So we see a dysregulation of their ability to figure out when they want to go to sleep. So you can usually tell, like, oh, a kiddo's sleepy, it's time to go to bed, and even their bodies know that it's time for them to go to sleep. But we see that completely disrupted when kiddos have been exposed to marijuana. So they may fall asleep at like noon in the middle of the day and just cannot be woken. They have fully entered into their deep sleep cycle. So that can happen a lot in classrooms, or just kind of in the middle of playing, just be like, I'm gonna go lay down, sleeps for 12 hours. But we see that the most in our reptile brain. And then this midbrain part, so that's the little piece between our Plato brain and our reptile brain, is for kiddos, specifically younger kiddos, we see this inability to soothe. So if you think about how your reality is being distorted by the use of marijuana, they are not able to kind of regulate themselves. We generally see that like cry it out method when you're sleep training and things like that. Like, it's okay for a kid to cry. I promise. As a developmental psychologist, it is good for a kid to cry. But if they have been exposed to marijuana, they are not going to be able to regulate themselves. So that means if you set them down and you're like, I'm gonna go make dinner, and they don't have that kind of safe, secure base around them, they're not going to be able to self-soothe. So they're going to have prolonged crying. Or they could pull away from a caregiver because maybe something is going on with their perception of that caregiver. Remember, that's distorted. Or they could be clinging as a secure base. So we can see that kind of wanting to distance themselves from people or wanting to be attached to like one specific person. So we see that a lot, and that all occurs, again, in the amygdala, in that part between our Plato brain and our base brain. And the midbrain and the hindbrain, again, those are with some of our acute effects of marijuana. So that's within the first, I would say, like 6 weeks up to 3 months, we would kind of see that midbrain and hindbrain. But then our forebrain, remember our Plato brain, if they've been exposed before the age of 25, we see a lot of these negative outcomes that are lifelong. So poor decision making. They're given 2 options and they're not able to weigh out the pros and cons. Learning, attention, concentration, again, ADHD style symptomology. So they don't pick up on the same concept that you've covered like 5 days in a row. They're not able to concentrate on a topic that's right in front of them. And then, especially as they get older, remember our forebrain, the top of our brain is that air control tower. If that has been changed, we see that their executive function decreases. So their ability to regulate their emotions, their ability to problem solve in relationships, their ability to connect socially, that is all impacted through that marijuana exposure. And so we have executive functioning deficits, decision-making deficits, problem-solving, so their ability to work through a long division or an algebra problem that they've been introduced to. And then some planning and reasoning, so thinking through logic, if and then statements. And then, again, the really scary thing about marijuana is that we see that a lot of researchers are saying it actually causes the development of schizophrenia. And I want to be very, very clear about this. It does not have to be a genetic link in order for a kiddo to develop schizophrenia after marijuana. What we actually see is that in kiddos and teens that are now developing it, they have no family history of schizophrenia. But now, because of chronic marijuana exposure, they are meeting the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. And what that really comes down to is this relationship between our reptile brain and our Plato brain. If they are influenced at high enough levels early on, kiddos can actually have this kind of gene switch on, that their brain is trying to protect them from their own substances, and so they develop schizophrenia because it maintains the homeostasis in their brain. And that is not reversible. Schizophrenia is a lifelong diagnosis and experience. So I want to kind of pause here, and I'll talk about the implications here in a little bit, but does anybody have any questions specifically about marijuana? I find that I get the most questions about marijuana specifically.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, I know we're going to get to it. Are there any, like interventions, like, for us, I guess this morning, like crisis workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if a kid is in crisis, right, or like showing some of these sort of symptoms, are there any like recommended ways to kind of approach them, kind of work around some of these?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we are going to get to that. And something that I really am glad that you brought that up, something that we really need to be clear on is that there is no medical intervention for any of these things. So, and I'm sure you guys know that, is that after this kind of initial substance exposure, unless it's an opioid at a high level, they normally just get sent home. And you just have to kind of ride out those symptoms. And we are going to talk about interventions and things like that here in a little bit. So thank you for bringing that up. Yes.
So, Helen says marijuana is legal here. So we do, I'm working with preschool age children. I have a lot of parents who, not like openly in front of me, obviously, they use it, and I'm, like, obviously that's happening. And I know that there's a lot of cases where that's a self-medication for a lot of parents. That's something that helps them. So what are things that we could do to help them increase the safety of the children? Obviously, if we tell, like, our advice is going to be like, hey, don't do that around your kids. Don't do that in your house. They're probably still going to do it.
Absolutely.
What are things that we can do, like, to help them with understanding how they're going to be exposed, and like how do they avoid that, like cleaning of surfaces, other things like that. What are tips that we could give parents?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Yeah, so something that I would really highly recommend is if you are working with substance using parents, we don't want to demonize use, obviously, because they're probably going through their own thing and they have their own reasons for use. But if it is impacting the kiddo, the number one thing I tell parents is, first of all, smoke outside. Smoke outside. Like literally anything, go outside. And then before you come back in the home where the child may be, you probably should change your clothes and take a shower. Like those are just kind of our baseline things. That if you're going to use specifically marijuana, use it outside, away from your kiddos, and if it's airborne, take a shower, change your clothes. That way you don't have to wipe down as many surfaces. The shower can usually express your sweat glands, and that can help dilute the amount that's coming out through your skin. And you won't have like the residue on your hands from smoking. Another option that I kind of tell parents is if you're going to use marijuana, I encourage using edibles instead. But huge caveat here. All the edibles look like candy for kids, so lock that crap up and make sure it is kept in a very safe, secure location. I always recommend getting like medicine locks or things like that, or keeping it someplace where kids can't access it like in any way. But edibles would really be kind of the safest option for the airborne marijuana, but there's nothing that we can do for like the exposure through the skin in that case. But it should be low enough with edibles because it takes such a long time to go through your system that it won't impact the child long term. There might be some small effects.
So this may be just observation, but your profession for the last 2 decades, writ large, have been trying and communicating that marijuana effects are not great, that it should be, it's fine, it can be legal. And now we're hearing this. I mean, you're countering, and we've had such 2 decades of saying marijuana should be legalized, it's not that abusive. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. I think that there's been a really big drug legalization movement without the input of, in my opinion, developmental psychologists. A lot of this comes from drug researchers who work in labs with rats, and they say, oh, okay, these rats aren't they can't make it through a maze, but they're not like unable to like perform like these really complex tasks. And so something that I really encourage is, again, if you're over the age of 25, all it's going to do is make you feel good for a while. But under the age of 25, it is so detrimental for your brain health. And I do think that that movement, again, for the past couple of decades has been largely without the input of how it may impact children long-term. Because we've seen that a lot in Colorado since legalization, is that achievement rates have dropped a lot because kids are just exposed. They walk out and they're exposed all the time. So I definitely think that there is a pendulum swing when it comes to a lot of scientific practices. We're like, oh yeah, this is really, really great. And then it's like, oh, we didn't think about these after effects of the people that we should be thinking about. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really, really important point. Yes?
For decades, psychologists were saying that marijuana did have irreversible effects on not just children, but people in general.
Mm-hmm. Did you say irreversible effects? Yeah. I think there has been some literature on the effects of THC long term. Sometimes it's a good therapeutic effect for especially people who struggle with PTSD. We have seen long term improvement in their symptomology, but there are, especially with amotivational syndrome, that's kind of our biggest one that we have studied long term, specifically in college students. But again, that's typically before the age of 25.
You said ADHD symptomology. I was just wondering if you could see a lot of misdiagnosis of ADHD and substance use, and if you can have those things together, are the medications going to help reduce the symptoms if it's not ADHD?
Yeah, so the thing with, yes, comorbid diagnosis of ADHD and substance use exposure is super, super common. There's actually a caveat in the diagnostic manual that says it is related to the onset of substance use, so you can kind of make that clarification. But something that I will say is Ritalin is an amphetamine. So it kind of, especially if their brain has started to maintain homeostasis around the methamphetamine, then the Ritalin will help with the acute symptoms, right away. I wouldn't recommend it because that means that they'll be dependent on Ritalin for the rest of their lives, and that can also lead to substance abuse later on. But yes, for the acute effects, it can help mitigate. But it's not something I'm yes, prescribe all the time. But it is something that can help in the very beginning. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about implications and what this may look like in your kiddos. So something I talked about a little bit earlier is in that kind of reptile brain. That's where our reflexes and our ability to grasp things is. Yeah. So in the classroom, we see that marijuana exposure is related to our ability to grasp things. So there's these really cool ways that we have this innate ability to grip things and grasp things and move our hands around. And marijuana kind of hijacks that. So what we would see if you're talking about a kindergartner who maybe hasn't had any intervention or any kind of intervention with parents, is they're going to have a really hard time figuring out how to hold scissors, how to trace lines and hold pens in their hands, and figure out, again, those kind of planned movements, but also the coordination with their hands and kind of planning out what they're going to do. So we can see those kind of things, especially early on in development, if there hasn't been any kind of early detection. We're going to get started again. Okay, so something I like to do when we come back from a break is ask if anybody has questions again. Now that you've had time to kind of percolate on some information, we're going to cover 2 more substances and then some ways that we can approach kiddos for interventions. But any questions right now that you thought about during our break or anything like that before I jump into our next substance? Yes.
When you're talking about the effects of I think you said it takes up to a year.
Yes.
To get rid of them, but would you still see them as they grow up?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So your question is, there are acute effects of methamphetamine, but what are the long-term effects as they grow up? So past that 1 year of it getting out of their system. And yes, there are long-term effects. So sleep can absolutely still be disrupted. So we'll kind of return back to that concept of the Play-Doh brain. So since they've been exposed to it, they're not going to experience those as extreme or as disruptive behaviors after about a year. But because that brain has been impacted at some time, it may not go back to what we would call like a typical developing brain. So we could see those kind of long-term effects in kiddos. But yeah, so you'll still see potentially disrupted sleep and things like that. Yeah. Okay. So I think if we don't have any other questions, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about cocaine use. So cocaine use is one of our highest substances that that kiddos are exposed to, but it also it mirrors methamphetamine a lot. So some of the common symptoms or effects can be kind of shared between cocaine and methamphetamine. So with cocaine, this is also a stimulant. So kind of going back to what we said about methamphetamine is it speeds up the messages between the brain and the body. So a typical brain is going like 30 miles per hour. A brain that is exposed to cocaine is going like 90. So we kind of see that speeding up of all of the symptoms. The good thing, if you want to call it a good thing, in cocaine or crack is that we know the chemical compounds of cocaine and crack and what's used to develop them. So it's a lot easier to treat cocaine and crack exposed kiddos, and it's a lot easier to provide intervention, whereas with methamphetamine, we never exactly know what was kind of the base ingredients for making the methamphetamine. So you can see some disparate symptoms, but with cocaine, these are pretty consistent across the board. And so a lot of the research that we have about cocaine or crack comes out of the 80s and the 90s in Baltimore. A lot of research was done on cocaine exposure to kiddos through prenatal exposure into early childhood. And so we're going to kind of return back to how kiddos are exposed. So again, we can inject, ingest, or inhale. So we have like our 3 eyes here. So kiddos can be exposed through a couple of different ways with cocaine and crack. However, much like methamphetamine, cocaine and crack are very rarely ingested, but we see that kids are mostly exposed through air exposure. Okay, so going into our hindbrain, something that we see for the acute effects of cocaine, so that's our initial dealing with our reptile brain, breathing, things like that. In kids, we see that they're very achy. So generally they're going to feel like an ache that's kind of deep in their bones, like a fever type of ache. And if a kiddo is able to kind of communicate that, they might say, that they're just like they need to lay down a little bit more. But if a kiddo is nonverbal and they're not able to communicate kind of those physical symptoms, there is this very particular high-pitched cry that babies who are exposed to cocaine or crack do emit. And it is designed to be super, super disruptive because it is saying, I need attention, I am not feeling very well. So it is something that we would say is a pitch above a typical distressed kiddo. So that's something that you can kind of be on the lookout for. And at the same time, we see really high sucking behaviors. So basically, when a kiddo has been born cocaine exposed or is cocaine exposed in early childhood, especially around the times where they would be using a bottle or nursing, we see increased kind of sucking almost on the air as a self-soothing technique. So it would be them kind of using that reflex to calm down their really, really shaky nervous system. And then in addition, in that kind of reptile brain that we have here, they have kind of tremors and shaking. So if you're thinking about how you kind of get shaky when you have gone a long time without eating anything, or you're really, really cold and you're kind of shivering. That is the kind of things we need to look out for with cocaine and crack. So these bottom 4 points, again, it occurs in this part that's already formed when we're born. And these symptoms can go away as the substance is withdrawn. But these are some of the things that we see as they're no longer having the cocaine or crack in their system. So the high-pitched crying, the achiness can happen during, but this kind of tremors, shaking, and sucking typically happens in the withdrawal period. So as they are kind of having the cocaine leave their system. And then for this kind of middle part of our brain, so the connecting part between the Plato and the core part of our brain, the reptile brain, we see that there is a huge change in emotion regulation. And again, we're going back to that habit formation reward, very similar to what we saw with methamphetamine. So again, their emotions are kind of all over the place after exposure. Some long-term studies have indicated that kiddos who have been exposed to cocaine prenatally are at higher risk of developing bipolar disorder. And so that's kind of a more long-term effect. And then habit formation and reward, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, but right now we're keeping in mind cause and effect relationships and kind of bringing those two things together. And then in our forebrain, so that's the part that is malleable and can be changed up until about the age of 25, we see this kind of fussiness, high anger. So we see a lot of aggression, aggressive behaviors, especially during the withdrawal period. And then again, much like with methamphetamine, high alert. So they're looking around, they're scanning for problems in the environment, and they have a difficulty self-soothing. So their heart is racing, they might be shaking, and they have a hard time kind of soothing themselves in that way. So if we want to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what this may look like in a more applied setting. So what I like to talk about a lot is potty training when it comes to stimulants. So kiddos, I don't have any children, but I was 5 years old when my brother started potty training, and I thought I was his mother, obviously. And I was in charge of giving him the chocolate chip every time he went in the bathroom. Because, good job, you're potty training, this is awesome. And really, really quickly, he learned that he did not have to do anything when he went in the bathroom. He just had to go in there, close the door, and come out and he got chocolate chips. He picked up on the habit formation and reward aspect of potty training, right? So it's like learning that pattern. Kiddos who have been exposed to cocaine and also really closely with methamphetamine, they're gonna have a hard time relating things that happen in their environment. So my little brother, he was like, oh, every time I come out of this room, I get chocolate. These are related to each other. Whereas kids who have been exposed to stimulants, specifically like cocaine, they're going to have a really hard time relating those behaviors occurring. So some really easy ways that you can kind of help kids create that cause and effect relationship is a lot of visual schedules and a lot of kind of personal engaging time where you're able to kind of draw out the way things are related to each other in the environment. So reading books specifically that you can draw a cause and effect line between behaviors if they're old enough to do that, that can be really, really helpful for those kind of cause and effect relationships. And then we'll move on to our last substance, and that would be opioids. And so we all know opioids and the kind of effect that they have. So opioid, this is the only drug that we're going to discuss that is a depressant. So basically a depressant slows down the messages between the brain and the body. So if a normal brain is going 35 miles per hour, a person who is using opioids, their brain is going 5 miles per hour. So everything is going a lot slower. And with opioids, you can be exposed through a few different ways. You can inhale it, you can ingest it in a tablet form, or probably the most common is injection of opioids. And the most common substance that we see in a lot of our kiddos right now is fentanyl, which is likely due to it being combined with methamphetamine. And so when a parent is smoking methamphetamine, and there's also fentanyl in that methamphetamine, it becomes a polysubstance exposure. But something I do want to stress is that here recently, there has been a bit of a trend of parents who may be using medication-assisted treatment, so something like buprenorphine, and giving their child a small bit of an opioid to help with behavioral symptoms, such as like ADHD-style symptomology or overactivity or inability to sleep. So we have seen more and more that kind of regulated opioids are ending up in kiddo systems. So what do opioids do to our brain? So in our hindbrain, so again, that already formed is not going to change. Reptile brain, we see in the withdrawal, the shakiness, they're going to experience kind of phantom pains. So they might feel more achy. It'll feel kind of like a more extreme version of a growing pain. They have gastrointestinal problems and chills and goosebumps. So that's what the withdrawal symptom really looks like. I like to share this kind of case study because I think it really speaks to what y'all are probably dealing with in the community. But there was a kiddo in one of the counties that I work with, and he kept coming to school, and he would spend the majority of his day asking for a bathroom pass and just being like, I have to go to the bathroom. And the teacher's like, you do not have to go to the bathroom. You're doing something in the bathroom that you shouldn't be doing. I don't know why you're doing this. And eventually, DSS became involved, and they found out that his parent was injecting him with opioids to help him fall asleep at night. And then he was going through withdrawal during the day at school, and he was having really horrible gastrointestinal issues. And he was really just using the bathroom, but he was just sick from the withdrawal from opioids. But because the teacher wasn't aware of that and wasn't kind of using that lens of substance exposure, he ended up getting in trouble up until like it kind of came to light what he had been going through. So I really think that that speaks to the way that kids might show up and who you interact with, is that sometimes these behaviors are not at all related to something that like they're doing something malicious, but it might just be that there's something going on specifically with substance exposure that could explain some of their behaviors. And I really want to raise some awareness about that. Okay, so in our hindbrain, we see those changes. And then with our midbrain and our forebrain, something that I really want to stress is that these top 2 points, the forebrain and the midbrain, these are permanent long-term changes to chronic opioid exposure. So lack of self-soothing and problems with learning. Learning was supposed to be on another line. So they have a really, really hard time being able to soothe themselves. And that's something that we've kind of seen consistently throughout a lot of these substances. And that's because, remember, our Play-Doh brain, that's where we have our logic, our reasoning, our thinking. And so as that kind of Play-Doh part of our brain is being disruptive, they're not able to say, oh, I know my caregiver will come back. Or I know that what I'm feeling right now is temporary. I trust what that person just told me. And they tend to have long-term issues with learning, so we see lower achievement scores. So kiddos that have been exposed to opioids or use opioids tend to have lower grades, test worse than kids who have kind of typical brains. And then we see a long-term problem with emotion regulation. So a lot of disorders related to mood and things like that. And then with our forebrain, so our midbrain, again, that's our amygdala connecting those kind of 2 parts together. Our forebrain is that we see a drastic decrease in social connection. So I'm going to kind of call us back to the video that I just shared about building strong brains and how it takes an entire community. Like, we need lots of people to help mitigate the effects of toxic stress and substance exposure. But something that's really unique with opioids is after chronic opioid exposure, your brain doesn't release the same chemicals when you are in a loving relationship. So I like to use this example. My mom just visited me. My husband and I just bought a house, and I am so stressed out. And then I saw my mom, and I'm like, oh my gosh, thank the good Lord, I can't do this by myself. I need my mom right now. Like, I love my husband, but my goodness, he drives me crazy. But there is a bond that I have, and there are chemicals that are released when I see a person that I see as a caregiver and a person that I see as consistent and showing up and there for help. My brain releases chemicals that cause my body to relax, right? Kiddos that have been chronically exposed to opioids don't release that same chemical. So they aren't going to feel that same relief or that same bond that they may feel if they hadn't been exposed to opioids. So they have this decreased feeling of social connection and bonding. So they're going to have a hard time attaching. And maybe if, like, you're a foster parent, you're going to have a more kind of resistant experience with that. And again, we can talk about the ways that trauma is also related to that. But we see this real difficulty in struggling to bond and disruptions in social relationships. We also see that they have a really hard time picking up on social cues. So typically, a normally developing brain, kind of in a real life context, we would see that, like, if you're about to leave the park with a kiddo and you're on their level and you're like, hey, we have to leave now. We can always come back later. It's going to be okay. Typically, this serve and return, that shared gaze that we talked about in that first video, typically with an average child, they're able to take that and actually the left side of your brains synchronize, which is super, super cool. And they're able to regulate based on how you're feeling. Right? So they're able to calm themselves down. And yeah, kids are going to have temper tantrums. But in this case, if a kiddo is substance exposed and they're looking to a parent or caregiver for regulation, they're going to have a really, really hard time forming that bond and that relationship. So they may not be able to regulate in that context. You might not be a safe space for them. No one may be a really safe space for them, especially if they have these endogenous and exogenous opioid disruptions. So we see that pretty consistently, and I want to be really clear, this happens in adults too who've been exposed to opioids. So we see those kind of long-term decreases in social connection because of how our brain is changing, especially if use begins before the age of 25. We see that kind of shift in social behaviors. I will talk a little bit about what you should do and some implications, especially if you're a foster parent or a bio parent and you think that your kiddos have been substance exposed. The first thing I really, really, really want to stress is don't wait to get intervention. A lot of kiddos don't get certain testing until their school age. That's around the age of 5, typically. But I would really, really encourage get intervention as soon as possible. We know that this kind of Play-Doh part of our brain is the most plastic and malleable and changeable in the first 7 years of life. So up until the age of 7, things that happen to you, we can kind of mitigate that for the most part with environmental factors, potentially pharmacology intervention, things like that. So within the first 7 years, we kind of see that intervention works the best. After about 7 years, they leave a critical developmental period and things become, basically the Play-Doh starts hardening, right? And it's harder to shape it and change it and help form those new connections. So really don't wait. I also really, really stress, especially if you don't have access to a lot of like psychological resources or psychologists in general, form a really great relationship with a pediatrician that you trust. What will be really helpful is also if you collaborate with DSS and you know that your kiddo has tested positive for some kind of substance and that's in their file, make sure that you kind of start creating that relationship with the pediatrician and tracking symptoms across time to see how that mitigates and changes over time. So I would really encourage create a good relationship with a pediatrician that understands substance exposure. And then access some testing. So as much as the research that I've presented here, there is still a lot that we don't know about kiddos that are substance exposed. Obviously, all of the research that I've talked about here, we cannot make any true causal inferences, right? Because we didn't assign some kids to be meth exposed and some kids to not, and then control their environment, right? We just followed these kids across their lifespan, compared them to their household. So there's a lot of confounding factors. So there's trauma in a household that could change some of this. So we do really, really, really want you to feel empowered to reach out and understand some of the symptoms for yourself. So we encourage, especially with some of these earlier drug exposures, we can see problems with hearing development, especially prenatal exposure. We can see problems with hearing development and vision. So you're going to reach out to your audiologist or optometrist. And then for those like kind of early childhood, like we were talking about learning how to trace or planning out movement, we would really encourage like going to a physical occupational therapist. And then for that like kind of quickened speech or struggle communicating because of substance exposure, reach out to a speech language pathologist because they're going to be able to kind of hone in on what specific parts of the brain and the language system have been impacted. And another thing that I'll talk about really quickly before I open up for questions again is we know that everybody is like an iceberg, right? We only see about 10% of what's actually going on inside. So a kid could 100% have substance exposure, but they also could have experienced some pretty significant trauma that is related to a lot of their behaviors. They could also have a fear of going without food. They could have been neglected. There are a couple of different explanations for how their behavior may be showing up. But with that being said, if you do receive hair testing, we can start to kind of narrow down, okay, they have been exposed to methamphetamine within the last 3 months. That tracks onto what we just talked about. It's going to fade after a year. And you can kind of develop more tools and resources to help get you through it. So information is power. I always encourage people to kind of try to gain as much information and tools as possible. Okay, so what are some of the best practices that we can do to help mitigate some of the effects of substance exposure? So something that I've consistently found as I work with parents across Southwest Virginia is that it is super, super important to be plugged into a medical system. So have your pediatrician, have the screening tools on hand, but they're not the ones that are coming home with you and helping you actually kind of flesh out what could be going on with your kiddos. So I want to return back to this pyramid that I talked about earlier. So we need to ensure that those physiological needs are met. So do they have a safe place to sleep? Do they have access to food? Do they have access to water, physical touch? Are they able to use the bathroom whenever they need to? Is your home absent of dangerous or illicit substances? So making sure that those first basic needs are met. And so a kid that has been exposed to substances likely, especially if they're pretty young, won't be able to explain or understand or put in context some of the symptoms that they're experiencing. So if you are 8 years old and your heart just races all of the time and you're just like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And I can't focus on anything and I'm getting frustrated, they won't be able to connect that at their age to something like, oh, my parents were smoking last night, and that's why I feel this way. So this isn't a permanent thing, right? So they are in a place where they can't even trust their own body to know what it needs. So they're in a place of like pretty extreme dysregulation. So I kind of want to return to the picture of a playground that I talked at the very beginning. So for us as caregivers, as support, we want to build this nice fence around their playground. So research shows, and this is so cool, research shows that kids who have a fence around their playground use all of the green space. They use the whole playground. They're over in the corner sharing secrets up against one side of the fence. And they're over here playing tag using up this whole side of the fence. But kids who play in a playground that don't have a fence tend to clump in towards the middle. And they don't fully explore outside. So we in this room, we are going to be that fence for them, that safe enclosure where they can kind of experience the full range of whatever they're experiencing. They don't have to stay towards the center in survival mode, but they can explore the full range of what they're going through, right? And so we do that through understanding what are those basic needs that I can meet first. What are some of the safety, security things that I can help meet? How can I make them feel loved and like they belong in the space that I show up in? And so when that child is experiencing fear and uncertainty in their own bodies, they're going to focus on seeking out safety, hunger and thirst, addressing fatigue, escaping scary situations, making hurts go away, and staying in control. So that is kind of, we're reverting back to the Play-Doh brain trying to keep us safe, right? So what are ways that we can infuse the spaces that we're in with knowledge that the kiddos that we may be interacting with are food insecure? So maybe having like a basket of granola bars next to your desk that is just for some kids that may come through that they're acting out. Maybe they've been exposed to methamphetamine and their bodies are just like, I need carbohydrates, I need calories. And that granola bar is able to get them a little bit closer to getting their physical needs met, which then allows them to kind of move up the pyramid a little bit more. Hunger and thirst, safety, fatigue. Do they have a safe place to sleep? Do they have a place where they can fully allow themselves to rest? And that might not be something that is within the scope of your ability to change, but it's super important to keep in mind that, especially if you're substance exposed, they're going to have disruptive sleep schedules, and they need to have a place where they can experience sleep in a safe way. And then kids are going to focus on escaping a scary situation. So I just said, go to the pediatrician. That's also really, really scary, right? For a lot of people, I still get scared when I go to the doctor. But escaping a scary situation, or maybe a person that is scary, and we'll talk a little bit more about some techniques here in a little bit. And then making hurts go away. I really, 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 really want to stress this, is that if a kid has been exposed to substances, they are more likely to use substances later on in their lives. That's just, part of that is because they have been exposed and their body is used to that kind of exposure, but also it makes hurts go away, right? So being on the lookout for any kind of self-medication, right? How are they returning their brains back to that homeostasis? Remember, their Play-Doh brains were solidified while substances were around them. So that's what they're going to go back to, potentially. So keeping in mind that self-medication and intergenerational substance use is all related, right? So I can speak from like personal experience that where I grew up, we have like a substance use issue, and I know of like 4 generations now of people in one family that have been in active addiction every single generation, right? So we're seeing a lot of this exposure early on, making the hurt go away, making that withdrawal symptom go away, and then the self-medication. And some people like to call it like naive relapse, where it's like you've already experienced this before, so it's almost like you're relapsing without ever using it yourself. So you actually get a higher high than a person that's never been exposed. And then we see staying in control. So we see a lot of self-protection behaviors. So that lack of social connection that may be a result of opioid exposure, we're going to see that even more if they are scared of the person that they're interacting with. So a lot more barriers and things like that. So how do we create that safe environment, that fence that they can kind of exist in? So we want to be consistent. The thing I say the most is be super, super boring. Just be kind of a boring person for a while. That doesn't mean you can't do anything fun or spontaneous, but having a routine, especially for some of the kiddos who have been exposed to substances and they have a hard time learning, having a visual routine that they can go through. Like, oh, I wake up at 7 and then I eat breakfast at 7:15 and then I get in the shower at 7:30. being very, like, almost too clear about your plans and communicating exactly what is going to happen, and doing that same thing time and time and time and time again. So as you're being consistent and being boring and letting them expect the same thing time and time again, that Play-Doh brain that is super malleable is going to start forming connections that are related to safety and security, and they'll be able to kind of move up that pyramid like we talked about, focus more on their math homework, or focus on dealing with conflict between their siblings. So again, being consistent, being boring, and whatever kind of visual aids, especially for younger kids, that you can infuse for substance-exposed kids is always super, super helpful. Providing alternative ways to communicate is also super important. So if a kid is feeling really overwhelmed, it may be a little hard for them initially to come up with the words and articulate what's going on. And again, withdrawal symptoms are not something that kids are prepared to discuss and talk about. So creating spaces and kind of approaches and techniques that help them communicate through like visual aids and things like that can be super, super helpful. And then we want to offer warm interactions. And so I'm gonna return, actually I'm gonna combine these last two. So offering warm interactions and being responsive. So like that first video that we saw with serve and return. So we want to practice serve and return with every single person that we meet, because that's how we build those healthy brains, right? And so serve and return, you want to be warm and you want to be responsive. So when a kid says something to you, you look at them and you respond with that eye contact. That's super important. And something that I also tell people is if your kiddo is young enough to like enjoy reading a book, I really encourage book reading. Book reading can actually rewrite the structure of your brain. So this like Play-Doh part of your brain can be rewritten through shared gaze when you're pointing at a book. So like if you are interacting with a kiddo and you're looking at them like, look, this is a cup. And you point to the cup and they look at the cup with you. That is called serve and return. And it actually activates both of the left sides of your brain and the kid's brain. And this is just crazy, cool developmental science. But as you continue to do that, like the shared gaze and the shared interactions, your heart rate becomes their heart rate, and you can actually synchronize your breathing and can do something we call co-regulation. So if you're calm, if you've got that fence up and you're like, I'm a safe place to explore all of these emotions, they're able to better regulate themselves. So trying to create that shared gaze and that serve and return back and forth. So creating those kind of warm interactions and being super responsive. Okay, so how can I build trust and connectedness? I'm going to show this video might be a little bit too small for the screen. But this is a YouTube video that I found a couple of months ago, probably, on YouTube, and it gives two instances. One that kind of is a bad representation of how to create this relationship, and the other one is a good. They're both pretty good, and we'll dissect this a little bit more later, but if you want to go ahead and play this.
Sweetie, we can't have dino nuggets every single night. We got to try some new foods. Yeah, here, look. I cut up some cucumbers, and look, it's a little kitty. Let's try. We need to try one, please. There won't be any ice cream until we have one. All right, so it's almost dinner time. What do you want for dinner tonight? Anything sound good? Chicken nuggets? Dino? Rawr. That sounds great. I'll make those now. All right, I have your chicken nuggets and your favorite chocolate milk. Do you want to eat here in the kitchen or at the table? Let's go. Okay, this is a cucumber. Have you ever had one? These are my favorite. I'm gonna cut some up because I'm kind of hungry. Do you want to try one too? You know what? We need ranch. I like to dip all of my vegetables in ranch, and maybe you like it too. Woo. All right, let's give it a try.
So I really like that video because it displays a few like little nuanced things that you can change as you're interacting with kiddos. So in the very beginning, her first kind of experience with a kiddo wasn't necessarily wrong. Like she still got down on their level and like tried to engage with them and be playful. But in the second example, she had the visual aid, so she was able to provide different options and like tangible things for a kid that may struggle with communication. And then they were offered choice, so they felt like they had autonomy over their environment. They were able to choose whether they wanted to eat in the kitchen or in the like living room or maybe their formal dining room. So there was choice. And there was also modeling. So instead of pressuring to do something that you really wanted them to do, you did it first. And again, using that serve and return, shared that interaction with the kiddo. And so what are some other kind of ways that we can build trust and connection? So again, being consistent, showing emotional warmth, offering praise, and being honest, so responding in a very honest manner, being sure to stay away from any kind of exaggerations or perceptions of like kind of a fake trust building. And whenever you can, interact playfully, respect the personal space, so respect their choice and their autonomy to make decisions, and that we don't know what could be going on and why they're making the choices that they are. But yeah, I think that's about everything. And now I kind of want to give you guys time to ask me questions. That's really general, and every single kid is super different. So if you guys have any questions about the way you can respond to kiddos who are substance exposed or some of the implications, fire away. Yes.
So if we have a kid who could have been substance exposed, but it's been several years that they've been clean from that, would it still be like impactful or detrimental if they were around like family members, like on vacation or something, use marijuana or something? Like how impactful is that to kids?
That's a really good question. So if there has been a kid that's substance exposed and then like occasionally maybe you're exposed to a substance that's being used recreationally, what kind of effect can that have? So generally what we see with more kind of recreational use is that, again, it's not persistent, so they're not being exposed to it every day. So that will take away one of the kind of detrimental outcomes. If it has been a long time since they've been exposed and they've kind of gone through with their withdrawal period, they've been in like a safe environment, the risk is not high that they will start just like displaying any kind of adverse symptomology. If it's something like a low amount of marijuana, again, encourage whoever's using it to kind of stay away from the kiddos as much as possible. But for the most part, we would not see the extreme symptoms here. The only thing I would say is modeling use and self-medication might be the only thing that I would be slightly concerned about, is like, oh, that's how people make themselves feel better and things like that. Yes?
Where does alcohol use and fetal alcohol syndrome fall into? Because I see a lot of similarities and things. Where does that fall into?
Yeah, so fetal alcohol syndrome, that is definitely along this spectrum. It's not something that I completely focus on because it's not something actually that's picked up in most hair testing kits. And this is specifically about kind of the kiddos in our area that we have been hair testing. But fetal alcohol syndrome, we actually, since it is prenatal exposure, we would say it's a more extreme version. And for like after you're born, remember that reptile part of your brain, that's already done, it's solid, it's cooked. If you have prenatal exposure, that core part of your brain is not. So we would see vast dysregulation of the entire kind of brain system. But that does absolutely fall along the same kind of spectrum. Yeah, good question. Yes?
Clarification, the answer is prenatal exposure, those effects are permanent.
So we can mitigate those with some interventions, but for the most part, prenatal exposure is fairly permanent, yes, especially more extreme exposure. And so it's something that I recently gave a talk to some parents who have exposed their kids to substances. We were kind of talking through what this looks like in their kiddos, and something that I told them is the earlier you use in your pregnancy, the worse your outcomes are going to be. So I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the minute you know that you are pregnant or expecting, you have to try to stop as quickly as possible, because the brain develops with that reptile brain first and then everything on top of it. And so that core brain development will be impacted in the earlier trimesters, and then it'll kind of develop out. But when we see the prenatal exposure, we see a lot more of the vision problems, a lot more of the auditory problems, and things like that. Yes.
Are there any specific interventions or things to focus on for individuals with ID or DD diagnosis that have been exposed after birth to these substances? Because a lot of those symptoms seem to cross over, especially I'm thinking of autism spectrum disorder with social connections and things like that.
Yeah, so right now there isn't a whole lot of research on specific interventions, but right now kind of where people are getting kind of the most help is through ABA, so that's applied behavioral analysis. And obviously that's a very controversial topic, and people have a lot of really mixed feelings about it. But that is one of the tools that a lot of especially clinics that I work with recommend through early intervention, is kind of using ABA style practices to solidify that connection between cause and effect. And that really strong pairing and modeling approach can be kind of helpful. Yeah, I think I saw your hand up. Yeah.
So what about the method that normally prescribed when your mom is like, I guess something else they feel like it's safer, or the effects similar?
Okay, so
experienced it because of the kid I have flooding, so that's why I was asking. Like,
yeah.
We see a lot of these behaviors, but allegedly they were switched in methadone in the first month of these pregnant.
Yeah, so what does it look like when you have behaviors and like the parent is on MAT? I have really, really mixed feelings about medication-assisted treatment. Me and one of the people that I work with is like, if we ever get, like, we suddenly disappear, it's because we talked bad about Big Pharma in this way. But something I do really want to stress is medication-assisted treatment is still an opioid, and it is going to continue to affect the developing brain the same way. It is not going to affect it to the extreme amount that like fentanyl would affect it. So it's kind of like the lesser of two evils. Extreme fentanyl exposure can, especially prenatally, can lead to a lot of deformities in brain development, skull development, things like that. But medication-assisted treatment, you're still going to probably have neonatal abstinence syndrome. You're probably still going to see those kind of same effects long term. And a question someone asked me earlier is, what do you do about breastfeeding, especially for parents who are substance using, or even the parent being substance exposed? And generally what we recommend is that if the mother was on medication-assisted treatment through her entire pregnancy, she can breastfeed, like she can continue breastfeeding, but because the kid is going to have to titrate with her off the medication-assisted treatment. But if it is any other substance like marijuana, cocaine, or methamphetamine, we encourage not breastfeeding, like whatsoever. And also, if the partner is still in the relationship and if the partner is still in active use, we encourage them to try to remove themselves as much as possible. Because, again, if someone in the household is using it, everyone in the household is exposed to it. So especially when it comes to methamphetamine use, we see a lot of that. I work with a few clinics in Tennessee that deal with the same thing. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there like a certain threshold? Like, is a child going to use every once in a while? Watch the place of developing that as someone who's like 7.
Yeah, so that is a really, really great question. Yes, so there is a dose effect. So what we would say is as they're exposed more, the risk of developing schizophrenia increases. So if like you're hotboxing in a car like twice a week, 3 times a week, the risk is extremely higher than a parent that smokes outside and then comes in on like a Friday night. So we're definitely going to see that the more use, the greater the likelihood of developing schizophrenia. But then we go into like a genetic kind of thing, and sometimes just through like innate genetics, the gene can express for schizophrenia with a couple of times of exposure, but that's very rare. So yeah, the more exposure, the more likely to develop schizophrenia. Yes?
Does THC exposure count for in utero as well? Or is it just once the baby's born?
So mostly what I've talked about, so the difference between like THC in utero and outside, like postnatal, we would say in utero, there are more negative outcomes. So we see more seizure disorders. We see more kind of movement disorders as well. And we see sometimes a wonky development of their vision system. So we see slightly different effects there in the prenatal, but we do still see those same kind of behaviors as childhood exposure throughout the lifespan. But yeah, yes.
And is there any way to test for that prenatally, or is it just like we could assume maybe this is what happened? Like it's just a guess afterwards.
Like test for schizophrenia?
Or for like if they had prenatal exposure?
Yes, you can do hair testing, and you can. Years after the fact, if you don't have any information, you have to kind of make your best guess. Yeah. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to stay up here for a while afterwards and just kind of hang out. And if you have questions that you're not comfortable kind of asking in front of everybody, I'll be here. But thank you guys so much for being here with me. I appreciate it. Thank you. My contact information is in the pamphlet. It's like on the back page before the references. So if you guys ever have any questions or concerns, comments, feel free to email me, call me, whatever you need to do. I am happy to dig more into this with you. So thank you guys.